Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting. I'd just like to advise that we've had apologies from Councillor Terry for this evening. The first item on the agenda is members' interest, but I'd just like to hand over to our monitoring officer who would just like to speak on the matter first.
Thank you. Councillors, just a reminder this evening that some of you might have discussed or voted on matters relating to this evening's topic at some of your town or county councils. So for clarity for this meeting, I'd like to advise you that you are considering this evening's business in the context of you being a member of Huntingdonshire District Council. It's very important that you approach this decision this evening with an open mind, taking into account the evidence and the advice presented to you this evening. If any member has previously participated in discussions or votes elsewhere, please can I advise you to declare that for transparency and confirm that you remain open to considering the matter afresh this evening. Thank you.
So, Councillor Hunt.
Thank you. Following on from that, I can confirm I am a member of Huntingdon Town Council, and HTC has previously shown a preference on the options available, but the decision was made before the full business cases were published, and I keep an open mind on the options and the business cases put in front of us this evening.
Councillor Hassel.
Just to really say that I've discussed this at Buckden Parish Council, and as my colleague just said, I'll remain open-minded on the decisions made here, and I've made no formal vote on this previously.
Councillor Byward.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Oh, not Chair yet, is it? Yeah, just to let you know that I am a county councillor and I am coming here with an open mind, and I will consider the evidence that's presented for us this evening. Thank you.
And Councillor Kadawari.
Just to confirm, I'm a member of that Huntingdon Town Council. It was also discussed, and as the same as our colleague, I'll stay open-minded.
Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. Yes, just to confirm that I am a county councillor, but I am coming to this meeting with an open mind, and I will look at all the relevant information provided. Thank you very much.
Councillor Chapman, did I see?
Thank you. I'm a member of St Neots Town Council, and we haven't actually had a discussion on this. I'm aware that the council is going to respond separately, the Town Council, but I will not be taking part in that in any vote that takes place in there, and come to this meeting with an open mind.
Councillor Oldman.
I'm not a member of any other council, but I have discussed this in at meetings of parish councils and informal meetings. I have my preferences, which I've made clear, but I'm willing to look at other options and nuances and variations of what's on the table.
Councillor Gledo.
In the same vein, I haven't actually voted alternatively either, but obviously I've had discussions with other local members in St Ives, but I come with a very open mind.
Councillor Jennings, did you want to?
Not desperately, but in the same vein, I have mentioned it in reports to the Town Council, but I don't believe that I have passed any preference of my own over and above doing what's best for the residents that I represent.
Councillor Catman.
Thank you very much. In the same vein, exactly. I've discussed it with my 6 parish councils, but expressed no preference, and come with an open mind this evening.
Go on. Councillor Pickering.
Just so we have a full house. Again, in the same vein, I've discussed in a number of public forums, but I don't believe I've expressed a strong preference, and I'm certainly coming with an open mind, willing to consider the evidence put before us.
Thank you. So I think we've possibly exhausted that item. So moving on to the election of chair. Can I invite nominations for the election of chair for tonight's meeting of Overview and Scrutiny? Councillor Gledo?
Can I nominate Councillor Nathan Hunt? Thank you.
Yes, and could I have a seconder for that, please?
I'll second that.
Councillor Catmull, thank you. And are there any further nominations? Councillor Bywater?
I'd like to nominate Councillor Oldham, please.
Thank you. And is there a seconder for that? Councillor Jennings, thank you. Are there any further nominations? So if I could ask to move to a vote first on Councillor Hunt, for those in favour of that, if you could please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, thank you. And for anyone against that, please. For Councillor Hunt, that is, thank you. And then if I could ask for those who would be in favour of Councillor Alban being in the chair, just for the evidence of doubt, thank you. And those against, presumably. Thank you. So I can declare that Councillor Hunt is in the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that moves us on to item number 3, the appointment of the Vice Chair. Can I invite nominations for Vice Chair of the joint panel, please? Councillor Catmull. Thank you. Can I see a seconder for Councillor Gledo? Councillor Cadawari, thank you. Can I see any further nominations? No. In that case, can I see all in favour of Councillor Gledo? And yes, thank you. Councillor Gledo? Cool. Well, thank you very much all and welcome to this evening's meeting. Before we start, I'd just like to make a few housekeeping reminders, as they've not yet been done. So, firstly, if you wish to speak, please can you indicate that you wish to do so, and myself and Councillor Gledo will keep an eye out for you. And in the event of a fire alarm sounding during the meeting, please stand and follow the meeting administrator to the fire evacuation point outside the building. And as a reminder, this meeting is being filmed on the Council's YouTube channel for live feed and subsequent broadcast. The whole of the meeting will be filmed, except for where there are confidential and exempt items, and a reminder that you may appear on camera even if you are not speaking. Thank you. That takes us then on to item number 4. So if you can turn to page 3 of your agenda, and can I please invite the Executive Leader, Councillor Comboy, and the officers present with us this evening to present the Local Government Reorganisation in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough report. Over to you, Councillor Comboy.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, everybody. We're reaching the final stages of this part of local government reorganisation. It feels like it's been a long journey, and I'm really pleased that we're here tonight. You're forming a joint overview and scrutiny panel, and you're going to look at the evidence that we're going to be able to put before you. I think it would be fair to say it's been a bit of a challenge getting to this point. 7 councils that all care passionately about their place, and each place unique and special. So you will have been aware of the journey that we've gone on to put forward a number of business cases, but our task is further complicated because we are only able to submit one option as a recommendation to government, and we must create viable unitary authorities. So it isn't just what's good for Huntingdonshire, we have to create viable unitaries with whichever recommendation is put forward. So as you know, we started with 3 potentially viable options being worked up as business cases. That's options A, B and C. You will be aware that then Peterborough proposed a splitting Huntingdonshire with a new option D that came to the table. And then you'll know that because of the changes that we knew were happening at RAF Whitton, and the growth of Tempsford as a newly announced new city, that changed the proposal for Huntingdonshire, and option E was proposed and taken into a developed business case. So tonight you have before you 5 business cases to consider alongside C and E, which we have developed as a council. But you have A, B, C. So you have A, B, D to consider as part of other council's propositions. You've got the opportunity to scrutinise the business cases, and as you've heard, we've got officers and our consultants team with us tonight to help you do that and do that fully. They're here to answer your questions, so please do I encourage you to ask those questions of clarification, particularly by the time we get to full council, we will be in debate mainly. So this is a really good opportunity to get into the detail if that's what you wish to do. I'm sure full council will then thoroughly reflect on tonight's conversation, and they will be given that to be able to help them with their thinking when we move into that full open debate. But can I remind you all, ultimately, this is government's decision. We will put forward a proposal on the 29th of November, but ultimately it's for government. So just in case you haven't been watching the latest updates on who's made which decisions elsewhere, I can just give you a heads up. Fenland District Council made the decision earlier this week for option D. That's their proposal to government. And you will probably be aware that Cambridgeshire County Council had already proposed to submit A. This evening, we know that Peterborough has also decided to submit option D. So far that's options D, twice recommended, A, once. We know that Cambridge City and South Cambs have publicly in their communications with their residents suggested that they may have a preference for B, but they haven't yet gone through that process. And we don't know yet what East Cambridgeshire's view will be because they haven't said that publicly. Like us, they're going through that process. So we've got some challenges because not only have we got to decide where we go as Huntingdonshire and whether we look at a 2 or a 3 unitary model, the real challenge is that there are pros and cons to all of the options that are on the table tonight, and I'd like you to fully feel that you can explore those without feeling that you are being led in any particular path, because that's what you do brilliantly in overview and scrutiny, and we want to support you doing that. I can assure everybody watching that whatever government chooses, bearing in mind it's government's decision after we have submitted, and we're told that will probably be next summer, whatever government chooses, we will do our very best to make that really work for Huntingdonshire. But obviously at this stage we're at proposal to government process, so that's some way off. I'm going to stop there, open it to back to you. So back to you, Chair, to pick up the questions that people may have.
And thank you very much, Councillor Conboy. So in line of the terms of reference circulated to members of the group, and of which you have a copy in front of you, we are being invited to review, comment on and scrutinise all of the available proposals developed for the geographical area in advance of the extraordinary meeting of Council next week, and the extraordinary meeting of Council the week after, where the final LGR decision will be taken before the submission to the Secretary of State by the 28th of November, after which the Secretary of State will make a final decision. The recommendations asked overview and scrutiny to note the contents of the report, the criteria and the process established by government, and that the Secretary of State will be the end decision maker. The panel are also invited to comment on the various options against the identified criteria to inform consideration by the Council and final approval by the Cabinet. And can I also draw attention that, to members that all of the documents referred to in the report are draft up until the point of submission. Following that, I'd like to open the floor to debate. Can I see any comments or questions? Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask for some clarification about Peterborough having made one proposal and having now made a second proposal, because I understood that we were looking at making one recommendation from this committee and not multiple ones.
Chair, if it's okay.
Yes, please.
So, Councillor Chapman, you're entirely right. We are expected to make one proposal to government. That's what government have been very clear. Peterborough originally decided they wished to debate in their council meeting options A and D, as my understanding. But tonight they have done that, and they have decided that D is the proposal they will be putting to government. So they have picked their single option.
Thank you. I'm going to come next to Councillor Orban.
Thank you, Chair. Just one brief one before we get into the debate. On page 2 of the first section of agenda item 4, the 49 pages, it says Council. I've got it down. 1 point. Sorry, there's so many pages to jump around. It's just this 1.2. It's on 4 it says brackets Rec E or the Cabinet recommended to. It goes A, B, C, D down to I. And then there's a bit in brackets Rec E. I wonder if we could have clarification of what that actually means, please.
Yes, Mike.
Through yourself, Chair, that's just cross-referencing back to the recommendation that will come under E. So if we run down where it says the Cabinet is recommended to, it gets to E, which is determine which, if any, the options the Council wishes to support, noting that the Council can only put forward one option. And then effectively F is to say we communicate that back to. So the reference in Rec E under F relates to E above it. So that's how it continues through. So it's just making sure that it's not business case E, it's about the recommendation that Cabinet are taking.
Thank you. Any following comments or questions from members? Councillor Gardiner.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, it's just a point of clarification. So if I've got this right, tell me if I'm wrong, each local authority will be submitting their own preferred solution. And then I read, perhaps I've read it wrong, that all the authorities were going to get together and come up with a proposal for the whole of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Is that correct?
Yep, so to clarify, the government's request is that they're looking for one single submission from all of the councils in the region. So the agreement is that that will be one submission comprised of a number of proposals which are put forward by the requisite councils. So in this case, if it was to end today, A would be going in based on the county positioning that A is their preferred option, and D would be going in based on 2 of the partners putting that forward. And then wherever we end up, wherever the other partners end up, those collectively would all be then submitted to government as one package to then say, there you go, that's the response from Cambridgeshire and Peterborough as a whole with the preferences set out.
Thank you for that clarification.
Cool. Thank you. Any further? Councillor Pickering.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask about the interaction between options C and E. So I understand, as we've already discussed, that we can only put one option forward. Now, it has been discussed, I think, at some point that we would have an opportunity later in the process to put forward a further option, perhaps as there's an appendix or when providing further evidence. So I just wonder whether you can give some more clarity around that, because I think that as a councillor in St Neots, I've seen a great deal of support for option E. It's a very attractive option, and I think it makes a case for a strong and independent Huntingdonshire, which is clearly very appealing to residents, hopefully of the whole district. But I do see like a big risk clearly with that option. It's a high stakes gamble, I think, in some ways, that by putting that forward as our preferred option, we end up taking option C off the table because no other councils are putting that one forward. And in my opinion, option C is much more strongly meets the government's criteria. So I just wondering if you can say a bit more about the process by which we might submit one or other option at a later stage, and whether you have any steer on which way round that could work for Huntingdonshire.
So I'm going to start sort of, if you like, in the political space. I think we've got a challenge in that we have options which form 2 unit trees, and then we have options which form 3 unit trees. And the real challenge is, by the very nature of 2 versus 3, they're going to be different. We already know that we've got A on the table, which is a 2 unit tree model. Now we've got 2 authorities picking the D option, which is a 3 unit tree model. So I suppose the real challenge for us, and I'm not trying to steer you, I genuinely don't know where we will come out, is we've got E, which is a 3 unit tree model, and C, which is a 2 unit tree model. So I'm not entirely sure where we might go with this, in the sense of I think that's something you might want to explore this evening, because you can't compare them because they are fundamentally different, because it's a 2 versus a 3. And you've got others expressing a three-unitary version, which previously we weren't considering. D was not something we had previously considered. So I think that possibly changes our dynamics a little. But officers, might you explain sort of about the consultation process? Because I think that might also help clarify that the evidence that we have created as business cases is still valid evidence. So perhaps you might say about submissions.
Yeah, thank you. So again, without trying to steer this, I can kind of tell you kind of the rules of the game, in effect, that we're trying to play with. These are government's criteria. So I think the first thing I would say is we saw in Surrey, where multiple proposals were put forward and councils formally submitted one option and then were referenced as being in support of another business case that was put forward. Government saw straight through that essentially and said, no, that council has voted in favour of this option. That's the preference for taking forward. The other business case that referenced them was taken off the table for not being compliant, i.e. they tried to bend the rules and got caught. So that's the first thing to kind of understand. So it's very clear we can only put forward one preference. I think it is worth then referencing the next steps following this. This is a process. Government are asking for preferences to be put forward. They will do an appraisal. As we understand it, compliant business cases will be taken forward to be put out there for public consultation. And it is that stage that the statutory consultation starts, where essentially this council will have another opportunity to comment on the final set of options that the government wishes to formally consider. The government then will be duty bound to take that into account when it moves forward. I think you will also see, by virtue of the nature of the business cases and the fact that we as a council are putting forward two options, we've used the same consultants, it's the same evidence bases. A lot of the information about both business cases is cross-referenced in them. So in the C business case, the option E is already referenced. In the E business case, C is already referenced. So the point is, some of that information is already going to be there within the thinking of government and available for them. Final thing I'd mention is the powers that the Secretary of State has. So the legislation that they are using for this is well-trodden legislation. It's been used in other places. And the readout we've had from across the sector has been very much, it has been tested, and that's why the government wants to use this legislation. Within that, the Secretary of State does have the power to modify proposals. He could equally say, go back to the drawing board all across the region, come back with other alternatives. But he doesn't have the ability to introduce a new business case as such. So it would be in that context that any additional evidence we wish to put forward at the formal statutory consultation stage would have to be framed. I think that's hopefully a good understanding of how that would work. How members want to lay that out and kind of respond accordingly is a political choice.
Thank you. I'm going to come next to Councillor Bywater and then to Councillor Hassel.
Yeah, thank you very much. I found the report hugely clunky and difficult to read, if I'm being quite honest. I don't know how other members found it, but I just want to touch on a couple of things, really. The options D and E, in layman's terms, how was it scored and who scored it? And can you just sort of tell me a little bit about the phases of producing this final edition that we've had before us this evening? And I'd also like to know about option D and how it came about. Who proposed it? Who was the person pushing it? I'm not clear who's actually pushed that. And if that's the case, and we're looking at northwest, the district being taken in with the Peterborough side, why wasn't Ramsey included as part of that? It seems like it's been just chopped off really and not considered. And I'd just like to understand that really, because I'm just a little bit suspicious of why really. So if you could update me. I have some other questions, but other members may ask them.
So I'll probably hand over to colleagues from local partnerships to kind of take you through a bit more detail on how the analysis, etc., was done in terms of the business case development. The thing I would point out within the report is there are sections in there that talk about the issue of splitting districts. That's the key thing I think to highlight in relation to the D option in essence. And you'll see there's commentary within the report about how we as officers consider that fits against the guidance and the criteria that is established there. I I think it's fair to say when you look at the detail of that it does appear somewhat arbitrary where those lines have been drawn. And, we are not close to the D business case in that way. The report is quite open that where we've been invited to collaborate on business cases, we have done, and we've done that in good faith. Where we've been asked to provide information, it's been as simple as that. And so I couldn't tell you the kind of ins and outs of who drew the lines, where they were drawn, etc. Sarah may wish to comment on that in more of a political space. But I think it's probably worth just handing over to Martin and Simon just to kind of give you a bit of an overview of how we've arrived at the business case development that we have and the scoring that's been undertaken.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the whole package of work, so both of the options, I think there were really two stages to that. Initially, we, Martin and myself, were working with officers on option C, with us concentrating on the financial and sustainable growth element of that, and then the wider team preparing the whole report. And then that bit of work was really, we did an initial sort of an economic a report and a financial report, which fed directly into the reports that you've got this evening. Then, sort of later on, we were then asked to, following on from Peterborough identifying the option D, we were asked to pull together the business case for E. So that followed on from a lot of the work that had been done on C. It obviously, as has already been mentioned before, it cross-references it and uses a lot of the base information, but obviously there are significant differences, and those differences are the ones that are highlighted in the reports. In terms of the structure, my understanding is that the structure was broadly agreed so that all of the councils and all 5 options, they have broadly the same structure. So that's where that came from, and that was really just to ensure some level of consistency. I think that's probably enough explanation.
Councillor Conboy.
In which case, and I will try and answer the political question, but I'm going to caveat it with I can only share with you what I understand is in the public domain, because that's the only information I have. So my understanding was that the 2 MPs for covering the Peterborough area, Andrew Pakes and Sam Carling, had written an open letter, or at least it was certainly a letter that appeared in public, suggesting that Peterborough might want to work and take part of Huntingdonshire. That was a proposal, and that was a strongly advocated one. I don't know enough about what's happened behind the scenes as to how Peterborough have gone through their internal processes for that to then have been made a decision to pursue. But certainly that's sort of the public presentation in terms of where it originated from, because when we had originally looked at this right at the very beginning as a group of leaders looking at viable options, D was looked at, but with a much smaller footprint, and felt probably not to meet the government's criteria at that point, bearing in mind that we have all been struggling to work out exactly what government's criteria might look like and how we interpret them. So I'm not going to say any more, but hopefully that gives you some clarity. But I think if you want further detail, that might be something we might need to ask our partners to provide that detail. I can only tell you what's appeared in the public domain.
John.
Thank you, Chair. Just one other quick point. I think Councillor Bywater asked about the scoring, how that was drawn together. So just for clarity on that, the scoring is done against the criteria that government have set. So those are a set of criteria that we need to assess against the business cases. So those are kind of one column that we'll look down in terms of the scoring. In terms of the numbers that are awarded, they're rated on a scale of 1 to 5, and those ratings are about poor compliance, effectively scoring 1, and meeting all of the factors that we can see in the government guidance, scoring a 5. So there's been that quite detailed assessment against the criteria where we can, accepting that in some cases, the description that government gives us is fairly broad. There is obviously that opportunity to look through and work through those things, but it's broadly around government criteria, and compliance against those has given us those overall scores in terms of how we've come up with those conclusions.
Thank you. On next to Councillor Hassel, and I'm going to come to Councillor Jennings.
Thank you, Chair. So I really just going back a little bit to Councillor Pickering's comments on C and E, really, and it sort of picks up, I think Michelle gave us some advice a few weeks back to sort of consider the three-way split and the two-way split as being sort of two separate things. And so should the region reorganise into two unitaries or three unitaries? And I think that one of the sort of big issues when I've looked at it is around, it looks like the two-way split seems to be considerably stronger, or certainly with the information that we have today. So I totally understand how there's a lot of sympathy for Huntingdonshire going alone, but right here, right now, it doesn't look that strong. And I support Councillor Pickering's request that perhaps if we come to a consultancy stage, is that you could plug in some criteria into the programme. But I do have some points of clarification actually that I would really like to go, because I do want to understand, because it does affect this how two-way or three-way split comes around, because it does look on many of the criteria that the two-way seems to be significantly stronger. So on page, I think it's 97 on your visual display, or 45. So it's 44 and 45, or 96 or 97. There's some tables, and just to kind of pick, I found it actually quite confusing, because if you look on page 44, if people are sort of trying to get to that, is that you've got U1 is Huntingdonshire, I think, in option A and option B, but in option C, U2 is Huntingdonshire. So I think just if we're going to use these particular tables in the future, I think it's going to be helpful if we actually put Hunts as being Hunts, so that it's easy for people to understand it. But I'd like to look at page 45 under option E, U2, and I would like some clarification on a few points, really. So just so that my understanding is correct. So where it says reoccurring net savings at year 5 for option E under U2 for Huntingdonshire, is that saying that after year 5 we've effectively made a loss of 1.1 million?
I can pick that. Yeah. Apologies. It's effectively saying, yes, you'll be taking in a recurring cost of just over £1 million, other things being equal. So it's not a loss. It's just, it's a financial pressure it's a recurring financial pressure that new authority would be facing of about £1 million. But it's got to be seen in the context of it will have a budget of over £200 million. So it's relatively small. It's about 0.5% of its annual budget.
But if you compare it to, say, option C, sorry, on the other side, on the same line, that would be 3.2 million. So just in simple terms for residents, is either I can have to allocate £1 million, or I can take a £3 million in. So in that respect, option C is much better, isn't it?
It's better. Again, I would look at it proportionally to what the overall budget is. So it is a saving of that magnitude, as you say. But in terms of comparing that to what the overall budgets of those councils would be, it's relatively small, so it's not material.
I sort of agree with you, but I did a quick calculation of, say, £4 million. We could fill 160,000 potholes with that amount of money. I could £25 a pothole. If someone wants to do a quick calculation on 3 million, it's a significant, and that's year in, year out. So every single year.
That's right.
Okay, and so is that why it says under payback years, it's not applicable? That means that it's never going to pay back.
It would take a long time, over 20 years, to pay back the setup costs.
Yeah, and that's why it says projected return from local government reorganisation as being red then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And just on the other side, and this is just I guess my viewpoint is that because we've already got option A going to government and option D and probably option B, I've sort of focused my attention away from option A a little bit because it's already going to go, and the two council unitary options seem to be so much more solid financially. But I guess I was, when you look at U1 on the savings share, it says 72% on option A on page 44. Is that sort of saying that Huntingdonshire would get a much greater amount of the saving with option A?
It's saying that Unitary 1 would get 72% of the saving that comes from reorganisation under that option.
Right. Okay. So in general, it looks to me as though that the benefits of local government reorganisation are significantly better with a two-way split than a three-way split. But I'll pause at that point and let other councillors make some points.
Thank you. I'm going to come next to Councillor Jennings, and then I'm going to come in after that.
Thank you, Chair. I also have several points, but I shall just keep mine to something a bit more general and going back slightly to the criteria question and how the scoring of the criteria. And actually, I'd just like some guidance from those who put the report together about why they have treated the 6 criteria from government as being equal in weight, whether they think there should be some sort of weighting between them. I'd also like to understand a little bit more about how the criteria seem to have morphed during the report. So, for example, criteria 1, if my understanding was right, the criteria 1 from the government was that the proposal should seem to achieve a single tier of local government. Well, quite frankly, it doesn't matter whether there are 3 unitaries or 2 unitaries, they're all achieving the objective of there being a single tier. Yet on page 83, the table says criteria 1, proposals seek to achieve the whole of the area, blah, blah, blah. And then it gives 2 unitaries a score of 3, but 3 unitaries a score of 1, and no change, a score of 2. Well, no change sounds to me like there's definitely not achieving the single tier of government, whereas the 3 unitaries would. So I was a little confused about how the scoring worked specifically in relation to that criteria. And on a similar theme on the criteria thing, the other criteria about government, it's my second meeting running of getting the done, I tell you. It's the other of those criteria I really want to have a think about is the size of the unitary authority, because clearly that's quite an important running theme throughout the whole thing. And the initial assumption was that the government were looking for around about 500,000 residents in a unitary authority, and that comes through on page 63. By the time you get to page 584, it starts talking about the preferred size being 350,000. And then on page 448, the preferred size is talked about being 300,000. I just didn't know whose were those preferred sizes. If the government has said my reading of the fact was the government said 500,000, but it wasn't set in stone. And if there was a good business case, they'd consider below. Where does this 300 and this 350 come from? So just try and work my way through those in order. In terms of weighting on the criteria, and should there be a balance that reflects one as being more important than others, government guidance is clear, there is no weighting. I think it's for members locally to look at those criteria, and for you, in terms of making your choices and recommendations about which to take forward, you may feel that one is more important to you, your residents, to the district, and for the people of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. So government's not given us that power to weight. We've therefore left it neutral, and I think it'll be for political debate to decide which of those is the more relevant. In terms of the scoring against each of the options, as I set out earlier, really, we've tried to grade those between 1 and 5. And in terms of how the criteria are described, the document's got quite a difficult job. We've tried to set out, effectively, fairly simple overview type stuff. So in terms of the summaries at the start, the government criteria are described quite succinctly. But we also want to make sure that the depth and the detail of how government set out the criteria is also displayed in the rest of the document. So you may notice when you read it through that the difference in descriptions, and that's because we try to kind of get that layering. So for a quick, easy read, to read the summary, you get the headlines. But if you want the detail, absolutely, you can dip in and read the detail that sits behind it. Sorry, Councillor Jennings, I'll pause.
I'm sorry, I think the point I forgot to make there really was that criteria one that started off by talking about, there being a single layer of unitary authority across the area. It's suddenly morphed into talking about economy and jobs later on, the criteria one, which to me, there didn't seem to be a direct input. It didn't seem to be a natural iteration from talking about how things were delivered to being effectively, growth and jobs and kind of thing.
So I think it's fair to say as well that as we've gone through the process, government guidance has been repeated and grown over time. And again, I think the report sets out some of those statements where we've moved from kind of an initial set of stuff in letters to what MHCLG have updated, to what we've seen from previous business cases. So that's why some of the criteria have changed over time. In terms of those other factors that you've described there, they're all contributing factors to kind of the durability and stability of any particular unitary that's recommended. So they're all causative factors towards each of those criteria, and the report's tried to set that out, how we can blend all of those considerations which are within all of the pages to give us an overall weight towards any one of those particular factors. So that's why we start with what might be a relatively simple description, but as we've worked our way through this, the combination of factors that adds up to make that scoring relevant, I think, has grown, and that's why the report, I think, covers those things through. The final question you asked was around numbers and kind of the descriptor of 500,000 or not. Again, I think that's one that has changed over time. I think the headlines at the start very much were 500,000. That's kind of a real strong governing factor. But what we've seen through ongoing consultation with government, through findings from things like District Council Network, from the LGA, that's softened actually in terms of the numbers. And I think government are very much indicating about sustainability, reliability, and a size of organisation that can have a future going forward. That proxy can be headcount of people, but I think it can also bear in mind lots of other factors as well. So that's why a number of different numbers are quoted within the scope of the report. It will be for government to decide how that weighting and how that evidence base is prepared. But what we've tried to do in the report is to give effectively good descriptions of the strength and robustness of each of those components, and those headline figures around population are part of that overall assessment.
And I think if it helps members, I've through this process, I've kind of likened this a bit to some of the colleagues that sit, or to members that sit on DMC will be familiar with this, where you've kind of got the weighing up of the policies, and then you've got other material considerations. And I think if you look at the background papers, and in particular reference to the Surrey decision, there's language used in there that don't talk about this in a pass or fail terminology. It's not a do not pass go, do not collect £500. It's a best fit with the criteria or better fit with the criteria. Taking a rounded decision is kind of where the government is looking at this, because, as John's quite rightly articulated, and your point is well made, and Councillor Jennings, is around, the headline fact about a single tier of government. Reading that doesn't automatically talk to things like 500,000 population, economic market areas, those sorts of things, which are layered within the guidance. So government have got a headline criteria that they've set, and then they've layered that with guidance. And so what we've tried to do is articulate that. So in terms of going back to the government's criteria, that first one, you'll see in there's a reference to, for example, the Isle of Wight. that having only a population of 141,000. And we've seen the debate in Hampshire about, is the Isle of Wight treated on its own because of its geographics? I think we all know that probably makes some common sense, but at the same time, it could fit quite nicely with some of the other options in terms of how services may be delivered in a more innovative way. So again, think about it in those terms of it is a rounded point. Your point about weighting is one that's well made, but we've seen no evidence to say that they should be treated any differently other than kind of a line in the sand against each other.
Thank you. So I'm going to come in next and I'll come to Councillor Catmer after that. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about overall financial pictures for the new unitary authorities, as I think that's heavily linked to the criteria that we've seen there. I think first bit of background is looking at the net revenue position across all of the councils compared to kind of the status quo. They're all slightly better off than the status quo, but it definitely doesn't fix any of the kind of wider funding challenges we're seeing. But I think that's some good background on the questions I want to ask next. So first bit is probably to our colleagues from local partnerships. So the data in Appendix 5, option B, reading it, creates quite a lot of disparity between the two unitary authorities with, and I quote on it from that source there on page 19, that the South and City Unitary excludes both of the two financially most challenged districts, and then the Horseshoe Authority for the rest of Cambridgeshire, but it's all but the least two financially challenged councils in a worse starting position. Firstly, kind of how did that modelling kind of come to that conclusion? I think a wider question than probably for HTC colleagues is how much of a risk does that create for the long-term fitting of a new unitary authority?
The approach we took was to use the medium-term financial plans of each of the councils published, which are obviously a projection forward of their best estimates of the funding and their expenditure and their pressures over the next few years. And then we were looking at consolidating those into the different council combinations that were being put forward under each of the options, and looking from a resident's perspective at if things stayed the same, LGR didn't exist, wasn't happening, what the position would look like for them, particularly in terms of the pressures ultimately that would come through for their council tax, and then how that changes through LGR if they're in a different council based on those pressures having consolidated their medium-term financial plans. So that was the process, and that's the basis of the assessment and the statement around worse off relative to where they are now, as an example.
I'll try and answer that, but I'm going to try and do it very thoughtfully. I think there is a real challenge because the 7 councils are all very different, and the challenges we face across each of those councils are very different too. So we don't have the same income generation, and I'm a very simple soul. For me, it's a very simple way of looking at your income as a council. You've got the money you make from your council tax, and you've got your money you make from your business rates. If your council tax base is low, your income is relatively low. So if it's mostly band A and B, then actually the pot that you've got to play with could be significantly smaller than if it was the higher end of your income and the numbers were bigger in terms of the number of people that were generating that council tax income. Again, your business rates. Our authorities are all very, very different. That's a real challenge. But then when you look at where the money goes, a new unitary, 75% or more is likely to have to go out in social care, that's children's and adults, and then special educational needs. When you look at what councils spend at unitary level or Shire County level, that's where the bulk of the income goes. So one of our real challenges is around those financial challenges, and then recognising that each of our districts, if you did it in district blocks, have very unique challenges about their populations, their income, how their economies work, the needs of those populations and the future needs of those populations. So that's one of the things that our colleagues have been desperately trying to help us with in terms of crunching that data and trying to forecast as much as they can what the future needs of the authorities might be. The real challenge, and I said this right at the beginning, is ideally what we want to create in terms of the challenge government has given us, but I also think it's part of my personal responsibility, and I suspect many of you will feel the same, is actually creating viable unitaries. And actually, we have to do that by looking at the fact that each council currently is quite different. So whichever combination you put them in will have advantages and disadvantages in the unitaries. I hope that helps, because I'm not sure it's an easy way of explaining. I'm not sure there's a magic combination which is best for everybody, because otherwise it would probably be so obvious we would probably have ended up with one proposal in front of you. But I think one of the real challenges that our consultants have tried to sort of help us work through is the fact that there are advantages and disadvantages depending on how you pair. And it's thinking about that wider conversation and understanding that actually, if you put two authorities that have real particular types of pressure together, but there isn't anything to offset that, that creates a new challenge that might not be a current challenge because they're not currently working in that combination. Equally, you could put two together and it could be a magic combination that actually solves lots of issues. And that's why the different business cases, as I said at the beginning, will have pros and cons. And I think the real challenge is trying to weigh them up and then look at the evidence and the data that our consultants have worked through, where they have been trying to help us look at those different combinations and say, this might be better because, but this might be worse because. Have I answered your question sufficiently? And I think Mike is going to help me out here.
But Mike, if you've got any more on that.
I was just going to add the final word. The alternative way of looking at that statement is about balance. And you'll see we've talked about balance in the report, that in effect you've got A and C that are fairly well balanced, I would suggest, when you look at it in overall terms. Comparing B into that scenario, B is less balanced or unequal.
Yeah, Councillor Gledo.
Thank you. Just very quickly, and actually following on from the point that you made, I noticed actually from the original evaluation criteria, the evaluation criteria is very, very clear. In fact, it has to say is to be financially viable in order to deal with SEND and adult social care and children's social care. So that's one of the key financial indicators that we would actually be a successful unitary, in fact, of modelling moving forward. So I would have thought that was almost like a given in terms of any viable model that was actually to be put forward.
So there was some detailed work commissioned by all the authorities across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough that looked particularly at the pressures that would come from adults and children's. And that has been reflected in not only the analysis that we've undertaken, but what all the other authorities have done, precisely for the reasons that it is so significant to the future financial viability of the local authorities.
And I think just to supplement that, Councillor Gledo, it's captured under criteria 3 in relation to, again, the description's not particularly helpful, talking about delivery of high quality and sustainable public services. But when you look again at the guidance and those proposals that have gone before us, adults, children, SEND, homelessness all fit into that as criteria that, whilst not extensive and exhaustive, are key headlines within that category.
Perfect. Going to move us on next to Councillor Katner.
Thank you very much, Chair. You've touched there on some of my worries that we've got criteria with sub-criteria and we've got layers of criteria. So you've had to deal with that, which I know is tough and difficult to do. So criteria 2 has got 3 sub-criteria. We've got to be efficient, we've got to have capacity, and we've got to be able to withstand financial shocks. So I know you've evaluated that as best you can. You can't rank them, that's fine. Come back to the point that we were just discussing, though, the balance. Because I looked at it at the risk to our residents. We are here elected by residents. I want to know what the risk to our residents are. And my reading, but tell me if I'm wrong, is that A and C are the lowest risk to our residents in terms of future costs, future tax rises, etc. Is that correct?
I'll from the analysis that we've undertaken, the financial savings are greatest in option A and option C. So that follows on. That is less risk to residents, but it's back to my earlier point around it needs to be seen proportionally, contextually. That there are significant pressures that will come on the new councils because of SEND, because of homelessness, such that they will outweigh the savings that will come under any of the options. So when you talk about a risk to residents, there is a risk, a financial risk, and that varies. But compare it to the financial risks that the authorities are facing as a result of the other aspects. It's relatively minor.
And again, I think I just return to a phrase that some members will have heard me say a few times about the exam question is not about what's best for Hunt's residents, it's about what's best for the region. That's the core criteria, and that's the key thing that we as officers can play back into, and we can give you that criteria. How politically you are judged and etc. is not our point. But I must reiterate that the question is about what's good for the region. And I think the other bit here is, again, as the report has tried to kind of suggest, as a starting principle, you have got a 2 unitary option and a 3 unitary option. They are not necessarily directly comparable, because the benefits and challenges, risks and rewards, whatever language you want to use, will be subtly different. There will be some commonality that comes through, particularly when we talk about how you can mitigate some of those risks. But essentially they are fundamentally different solutions for the region, i.e. 3 or a 2.
Thank you. On next to Councillor Alban, and then after that, Councillor Pickering.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 2 distinct questions. If I can come back to the second one later and allow others, because the first one actually follows on quite nicely from what we've just been discussed about what's best for the region. And one of my concerns so I've got some concerns before I come to the question, is how that's interpreted. I've got concerns that it's being interpreted in different ways. I'm trying to be generous to our partner councils as to what they think is best for the region and what they think is best for their council. My concern is that Huntingdonshire, if we play by the rules and the strict interpretation and other councils don't, what weight the government gives to that. You talked, Mike, earlier on about areas of Surrey being caught out. How does that play out? So they're my concerns. My question is, who decided the criteria? How strictly are we sticking to it, and how assured can we be that the government will look at that same interpretation and give the same weight to how other councils might have interpreted it differently?
Yeah, there's probably a 2-part answer to this. So, are we certain of the criteria and what they are? Yes, we are. Are we certain that we've approached the scoring that we've used against those criteria in a consistent and well thought through way and well considered way? Yes, I would give you that assurance. I think we brought in the right specialists to advise us where we need to and have considered that in that way. I'm going to hand over to Councillor Conboy in terms of how the criteria were arrived at and what the end outcomes could be, because those are ultimately political pieces.
And I think it would be fair to say that councils will make political decisions in the same way. I guess we will need to think that through when we come to full council and the debate that we have. I think for me, one of the challenges I have been reflecting on, because I only had the news while I'd arrived here that we had a decision made by Peterborough, is I think one of our challenges, going back to what you heard officers say around we're all operating in theory to the same set of rules. How will they be weighed when they go into government? Well, we don't genuinely know that, because we won't know till we submit and then government think about it and come back with a response. I think one of the new challenges is we have 2 councils picking a 3-way split. 2 councils have now picked D, which I don't think some of us had necessarily had suspected that that's where we might end up. Given that you've heard from officers around the Secretary of State cannot put a new option on the table, he can only pick from the options that are proposed, but could seek to modify one. I think that gives a new challenge for us in our thinking, depending on which options we think others might put in. In other words, I'm going to suggest there maybe needs to be some tactical thinking here as well around which options we put to government and why. I'm not going to suggest which we ought to do. I'm going to say my personal reflection as of about the last hour is that the landscape has shifted slightly. Two are suggesting a three-way model that splits Huntingdonshire. We are looking at a 2 and a 3 if that's based on the business cases we have developed, and we may have a different view when we get into full debate that actually we want to pick something completely different. But I think then it's thinking through that if a Secretary of State can only pick what's in front of them, but could modify, does that change our thinking? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a new nuance that if you'd asked me an hour ago, I didn't think was necessarily one we needed to be thinking about. So I'm sorry, because I think I might have just made our jobs much harder in terms of how we consider what's before us. But I think it would be naive not to consider our response in the landscape of other people's recommendations, because that's not in the rules anywhere. But the answer is, depending what other people put in, depends on which options we might think would be more likely to find favour or less likely, or to modify a suggestion. I'm going to leave it there, but hopefully that's helpful for our thinking.
I think the only other bit I'd add from the officer space, again, colleague Beth has been on a lot of the webinars and talked to people who've been through this process elsewhere, and the legislation I come back to is well-trodden territory. It has been challenged through judicial review. The Secretary of State will ultimately have to be mindful of that, you know, if it gets to the end of the process, and excuse me for cutting straight to the chase, if it said these are my published criteria, but I'm going to make a decision over here that completely disregards them, clearly that brings with it a risk for the Secretary of State and for government, you know, that others may wish to challenge. And we've seen in communications, for example, Runnymede Council down in Surrey, putting it openly out there that there are risks around challenge of you know, and threats of those challenges that have been put out there by some councils. So, you know, this isn't a landscape where the Secretary of State is completely unencumbered to do whatever they want. They will be mindful of that they will be subject to that risk of statutory review if they step outside of the kind of boundaries. You know, who challenges that and to what extent, again, that falls into the political arena for councils up and down this country, but everybody's having that same debate. But I just want to be really clear that the legislation that underpins all of this process is not new legislation, and it's stuff that's been tested heavily.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow up on that, one of my concerns is that, I'll be careful what I say here, because potentially we've got to work with some of the partner councils, that you've got two councils that have made the same decision for very different reasons. That concerns me, what the implications of that and what that might end up leaving us all with. That's a statement rather than the question. Whether you like to comment on it, it is up to you.
I will, but I'm going to say this very sensitively. Don't forget, we have still got political processes that will unfold as part of this as well. So once a proposal has been gone through the process and we've got whatever the new combination is going to be from government, there will then be elections for the shadow body. So whilst councils may have made decisions based on their current membership, there will then, within 2 years, we will have new shadow bodies that will form the new councils. So yes, councils will make reasons, will have a view now based on their current constituents. This is to create new unitaries, and I think that's really crucial. So going forward, this is not expanding existing unitaries. This is supposed to set up brand new unitaries. So this is not Peterborough getting bigger, because in theory Peterborough becomes a brand new unitary, whatever that new unitary becomes, if that's where we end up. It's not Fenland getting bigger, because it would be a different unitary. So that, I think that might help free us a little bit from current decision making is rooted in where we are today, but those new bodies are going to need to grapple with the fact that this is a new opportunity, new body, new unitary, take us forward into a new era. And actually, we will be part of that. We will have to be somewhere with a new unitary and a new era. I'm hoping that's helpful, but I recognise the point that all of us will make decisions based on where we are today, but who's got to deliver this will be a new group of councillors. It may be some of you, but it will be a new group of councillors and a brand new unitary in 2 years' time.
There you go. Just to give a heads up, I have a very long list of people who want to come in and speak on it. So if I haven't called you straight away, I haven't missed you. I'm not ignoring you. It's just we have quite a long list. The next two on it is Councillor Pickering next, and I'm coming to Councillor Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to return to option E, if I may. So it seems clear that population is a really critical factor when it comes to thinking about the success or otherwise of option E. There's a particular point that I wanted to make on the data, which is on page 335. It shows the 2040 population of Huntingdonshire. Sorry, on page 332, it says that the population will be approximately 300,000 by 2040. But then a couple of pages later on 335, the Huntingdonshire 2040 population is shown as 213,000. So that's quite a big discrepancy. But the more general point or the more general question really that I wanted to put was that the option E and the boundary review seems to be a bit of a chicken and egg kind of situation, because I think the success of option E is really dependent on a boundary review, it seems, in order to get the population closer to something which would meet the government's criteria. But clearly a boundary review, is necessary for option E to be viable, so we can't really put option E forward until there's some certainty of a boundary review. But if a boundary review takes place, that upsets potentially the balance of any of the other options. So I'm just interested to hear, what your comments are on the sort of interaction between the boundary review and the timing of the decision, because I think they're both really interdependent on each other. They both impact each other. I'm just interested to hear when, what the timelines look like in terms of those two events, really.
Through yourself, Chair, if I may, I'm going to bring Martin in first on the point about viability to start with, irrespective of Tempsford, because I think the key point I think that Martin and Simon tried to articulate earlier is, as they've been approached to commence this work, they've almost done that gateway review of kind of, are we making a reasonable assessment to be spending taxpayers' money on pursuing this further? So I'm just going to ask Martin to come in on that first bit about financial viability without Tempsford, and then we can pick up Tempsford. I'll follow on from.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so the viability of under option E, we talked about that recurring £1 million pressure, but seeing it in the context of the overall budget and also predicting the future and how the demand for the key big services like adults and children's will press on that. So as things stand, there isn't, from our perspective, a particular concern beyond the natural concern that we all have about the future viability of local government and funding. There isn't a particular concern with the configuration under option E from a viability perspective. So it remains a valid option financially.
So I think in that context, that's kind of where we've started from. So then you'll see on, excuse the page references for me. So it's when we've got into the main cover report on page 33, we talk about, the size guidance piece, as we've explored earlier, and where the DCN sits with that. But then we've then gone on to talk about those population projections, bearing in mind Hunt's existing growth that we've got planned and that's been accounted for, which Martin is articulating as saying starting point is it's a financially viable opportunity. To distill it down, I would read that, the ability to incorporate additional population, additional council tax base, additional business rates, income, et cetera, only potentially heightens the opportunity around option E in terms of better meeting the criteria, but also being more financially sustainable, more financially viable. In terms of the boundary review, there's a whole section on that from page 34 that hopefully tries to articulate this. And again, whilst the point about Tempsford has been known about for some time, the government's ambition around new towns and how that comes about and the new towns task force report has only been relatively recent. And we are responding to that opportunity. And I think the report that sets out there talks about that, one of the delivery models that the Newtown Task Force talks about is that being that Tempsford opportunity. And again, whether that's 40,000, 100,000, the numbers vary depending on where things land. But we have done an assessment of the existing sites we know about from a planning perspective, where they sit relative to our existing boundaries. And the reasonable assumption is that in the short to medium term, those units, until their infrastructure is up to speed, they are likely to be reliant on St Neots, for example, as the largest town in and immediately around. So the business case is essentially saying, look, the opportunity is there to do a boundary review. It's a factor that government have said, don't worry about boundary reviews now in advance of doing your business cases, but you can ask for them to be done at any point in time. You may ask for one essentially as part of your business case ask, and at the later stage if a proposal is taken forward. And then what we have tried to do as officers is set out what the potential benefits of that could be and the rationale for that relative to, as I say, the relationship with St Neots between some of those existing settlements. And we know from Councillor Chapman's previous references to the neighbourhood development plan for St Neots, noting that some of that work has already been done by the consultants to do some of that identification of sites and potential land. And actually, when you take it slightly wider out, some of that land could already, if we left boundaries as they are, could involve bits of Huntingdonshire being considered within Tempsford in inverted commas, noting that there's no formal boundary yet for what Tempsford is. So a bit of a long-winded answer there, Councillor Pickering, but what we've tried to say is that, again, applying a planning analogy, the policies are the criteria. There's these other factors that are material, and we could present as material factors to government to say why option E is the most appropriate solution for Huntingdonshire, taking all the factors into the round. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Going to come next to Councillor Chapman and then Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. I have a question relating to page 448 or 176. In the fourth paragraph, it refers to Huntingdon's most respondents tend to remain within the area when travelling to work. Now, this is something that's not my experience and statistically not correct for the 25% of the Hunts population that live in St Neots and the surrounding settlements. There are 75,000 jobs in Huntingdonshire. This is probably a little bit out of date, but not much. 112,000 working people. For St Neots, we have 11,000 jobs, just under, and 31,000 working population. So there's a jobs density within Huntingdonshire of 67,000, and it would be higher than that if it wasn't for a jobs density in St Neots of 34,000. Now, I'm very aware that more than half of the population, nearly 75% of the population of St Neots, actually travel out of the area to go to employment. The largest thing is people going into London and Hertfordshire. They go then to Cambridge and east to South Cambs and to Bedfordshire. The very small population actually goes to Huntingdonshire, and so the employment for St Neots is based more in South Cambs, Beds and London, and that doesn't agree with this. And I think if the respondents have said they all work locally or predominantly work locally, then there's a bit of a disconnect between Huntingdonshire as a whole and the employment prospects in my particular area of the district. This really does make a difference as to which option I personally think would be in the benefit of the residents of my area, and I think that it highlights the division which option E perhaps indicated that. Option D indicated in that there is a split between the activity and the nature of the south of Huntingdonshire with the north of Huntingdonshire. I think that's about it. I'd be interested in any comments that you might be able to offer or explanation about employment within Huntingdonshire rather than commuting.
Thank you, Councillor Chapman. So it's a good question, and I think it's an important variable to work its way through. In terms of where the data's come from that's sourced within this report about travel to work and about where people do that from what location, the data's linked from within the report, and it's drawn from the census from 2021. So it's drawn from that information drawn by the Office of National Statistics, cut and sliced for us in terms of our district. So the data's from that valid data source. In terms of your own perspective around residents within St Neots, absolutely recognise that you've got that knowledge from a local perspective, but the data's clearly sourced from the census, so therefore we've based it on that best available data from a national data set.
If I can clarify, the figures that I gave you were from the Inner Circle report commissioned by HDC using the census data. It's not local knowledge as such, and it was work that was done in preparation for the master plan.
Obviously drawn from the same data set. The numbers that we've put in here are absolutely drawn from the same numbers, so quite where there's a disparity, I think we could take that away and look at it, but we've used the same data set.
I think just to add and elaborate on that point, I know Councillor Chapman, you've just referenced there, the purpose of that report was in relation to the master plan as well, and it was a piece of work that was done at a point in time. The information you've got before you is the consultants we've got that are tasked with a particular work relating to local government reform as opposed to a wider regeneration project. So we have to think about it in those terms, and it is the best available information and interpretation as at this moment in time.
And very briefly, I think one of the real challenges we have is our district is so big, and depending on where you are in the district, probably really does depend on where you look to travel to work, and equally the kind of work you do. So if you're on sort of the western flank, you know, it's not uncommon for people to say, well, actually, I'm travelling into Northamptonshire. So again, and that's not even within our local government reorganisation collection here. So I think the real challenge for us is travel to work is important, but it may not necessarily help us with all of our decisions because the whole district is very different, and depending on where you are located in that district and also what you do for a living might depend on where you go. What it doesn't do though is it's not forecasting where people will go. And some of the economic growth that we are looking at specifically in Huntingdonshire actually potentially will open up job opportunities within Huntingdonshire that don't yet exist. That's really exciting, but also that some of that will happen across the combined authority. So the real challenge is that census data, it's valid, but actually what it's not going to help us with is the second guessing and actually what will those patterns look like in the future. But I think the important point that you're making, Councillor Chapman, is actually where people travel to work is an important part of how we identify of what's important to us as individuals and what matters to communities. I don't have an easy answer though for what we do with the ones that are not within the local government suite of places we're looking at.
Perfect. I'm going to come next to Councillor Gardner and then to Councillor Hassel.
Thank you very much. Yes, with regard to option D, I just don't know how that really has come about when we're told that the government's main criteria is that the councils, the existing councils, should be the building blocks of the new unitaries, whereas that proposal goes totally against that criteria. So I just don't see how that has come about and how the other authorities, if they've all been told exactly the same as we're being told tonight, how that one has then gone forward in two separate authorities. So that's what concerns me there. Are we all getting the same information? Then with regard to...
Shall I just come in on that? Because sorry, Councillor Gardner, that just might help. I think the real challenge is, and I'm going to say this again with great sensitivity, my personal view is it's been an iterative process from central government. So I was in one of the very first meetings when we had the briefing on this with chief execs across the country. We were all online and we were given very clear criteria. And then on the second meeting, the nuance of wording in the second meeting shifted some of those criteria, because it's very easily done, isn't it? You say one thing and then you just frame a sentence slightly differently because you're not following a script, and suddenly the nuancing shifts slightly and everybody kind of goes, so does that mean that you don't have to do that? I think it would be fair to say we've seen a number of iterations, and we have then had a number of clarifications coming from the Secretary of State and ministers to say, I want to clarify the position. It is still like this. So strict criteria on numbers, strict criteria, but actually you can make a case if you wish for why you might vary that. Unhelpful for us because it's not definitive. It brings in an area of ability to flex. The conversation that it should be based on existing council building blocks, unless there is a very good reason not to, I think might have been the phrase, but please don't quote me on that because I'd like to go back to the letter that came out and clarified it. In other words, there's a greyness back in the, you might be able to make an exceptional case to do something different. I think that probably hasn't helped us in terms of why some then are proposing something different. My personal reading of some of that, having sat in those meetings and also asked those questions directly, is that my understanding was, I think ministers may have thought that if it was some moving, it was more around small adjustments, not necessarily big adjustments, would be my take and my interpretation of what I believe I heard. But we will have to see, because we now have a business case which is not a small adjustment, it's quite a significant split of Huntingdonshire, option D. And I don't know whether ministers will therefore, when that is submitted, consider that meets their criteria or it doesn't. Because we don't know, because it's untested.
1 second.
I think just to further pick up the point, within your papers, you will see a background paper that is linked to the government's summary feedback on the interim proposals that were coming out. As I'm sure you can imagine, councils up and down the country asked this point about, well, what's the position on splitting districts? And just to quote from that, and from, this is on the government's published website, existing district areas should be considered the building blocks for proposals, but where there is a strong justification for more complex boundary changes will be considered. So that hopefully provides the context for that. Everything else in terms of how people have interpreted that and arrived at different business cases is a matter for them ultimately.
Thank you for that. So from that, what I can't see anywhere in the report is the justification for the breakup of Huntingdonshire into the format enclosed in option D. I see no justification for that at all. So that concerns me. And then going forward, if we were to go for option E, which is a unitary Huntingdonshire, that appears to me that would work, especially if we use shared services as we currently do with Cambridge and South Cambs. That would be a small unitary that they want. So that to me would seem to work in the favour of both Cambridge and Cambridge City and Huntingdonshire going forward. So in a way that would benefit all the residents of both those three authorities. It would get what they want, but it would also give those authorities what they want to do as well. But we would have the joined up thinking where we would work together. So that's just something, that's come out in the report that I just think we need to be aware of. And it has worked well where Huntingdonshire has worked with Cambridge and South Cambs. So I don't see why that wouldn't work in other fields, whether it be highways or whatever. I don't see why that wouldn't work going forward. but we would each keep our own identities, which I think is quite a strong priority for our residents. Thank you, Chair.
So again, two-parted response to this in the double act way. So I think you will see at various sections of the cover report that's been put forward. So if I just reference page 27, we've talked about comments on option D. So we have, as officers, in conjunction with our consultants, tried to not critique other people's business cases, because as we've said, there are partners that we've got to work with across the region, but we've kind of looked at those through the lens of, okay, how does this align with the criteria? And we've given you that scoring throughout the report, and we've highlighted some areas of those challenges. In terms of the logic and things like place identity, rationale for splitting, along where, essentially where has the line been drawn? You will see we've made comments about that within the report, and I've mentioned earlier that ultimately I'm not sat here representing Peterborough and being able to kind of answer on behalf of Peterborough. That's kind of a question for them, but we've kind of given you a summary based on that at sections within page 27, 28, etc. So I think that is hopefully helpful as the debate moves forward to full council, that issue is something that we've considered and hopefully given members a flavour of. Ultimately, you will draw your own conclusions. I think in a similar vein, in reference to shared services, you will see that that's also covered under the other considerations section of the cover report. In terms of page, bear with me, it falls into page 38 and 39 in terms of that shared services arrangement. We recognise that there are examples of that shared service arrangement. The government, in their criteria, have kind of talked about local government reorganisation isn't simply about sharing services. It's about starting afresh, bluntly, but it doesn't rule out councils or the subsequent authorities sharing those services. So again, we've kind of tried to articulate that for you as another consideration before members to weigh up. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Councillor Conboy.
Thank you, Mike. And I suppose only to say on shared services, yes, we do have a strong history. I think it's had some challenges over the years, as anything does. We're in a really strong place at the moment. It's actually changing some of our transformation delivery. So I think that's the thing to hang on to around shared services. Actually, government has set the challenge about, this is about transformation and this is about delivering services better. It's about delivering them more effectively. Arguably, it's about delivering them more efficiently, but you could argue that efficiency isn't always just about the money. It's about the impact and the actual how it lands on the ground and whether that's working better if you work differently. I think there's a real basis that you could build from those shared services in terms of you could use that to drive further forward transformation, greater savings over time, and more innovative working across a different partner footprint. And certainly other places around the country are actively looking at shared services, even with local government reorganisation. And I think some that have reorganised are also now saying, well, we've reorganised, but actually shared services may actually add some value. So I think it's a really good point. We are unusual because we already have established partnerships and lots of places do not have that to call upon. And it may well be that our existing partners can see some value in that. Certainly the challenge would be is if we decided to dismantle those between now and LGR, I suspect that would not work for anybody. And so whatever happens with local government reorganisation, I suspect there will need to be a transition phase, but actually that could segue into a new opportunity for further delivery.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come next to Councillor Hassel and then Councillor Bywater.
Thank you, Chair. So just to kind of recap where I think we are, so just picking on upon Martin's comments about in the great grand scheme of things, because of the potential costs of social care, et cetera, is each of the models are viable. I think that the exam question that we're being given is to find the most viable option rather than trying to sort of say option E is viable or option A is viable or whatever. It's the most viable. Officers have produced as a report which quite clearly says option C is the most viable option. from the criteria. So I think we should bear that in mind. But just picking up on Councillor Gardner's points, because I was going to make a point about shared services, and I hadn't really considered that option E, we could also make use of shared services. So I think that's a good point. And shared services, I mean, effectively, when you look at option C, we're kind of a long way down option C already, because for many years we've been making a 15% saving year on year from shared services. It's previous administrations under Joe Lancaster have really kind of pushed shared services in order to make us work much more closely with City and South Cams. And having done a lot in the merger and acquisition space, which I know isn't quite the same as what we're doing here, because this is creating up a new unitary, but it is very, very similar. But your IT base is absolutely critical. And one of the things I'd like to see us to do is to strengthen the argument. And it sounds like we can strengthen both E and C, but primarily C is and I'll explain why I think it strengthens C more than E, is that common IT infrastructure, and obviously the legal and the building services, is a massive, massive baseline. It means you don't have to change any of your IT systems. You can start from day one using the same systems. And I think that the real big plus about it, and having ran the portfolio for a little while, is you suddenly pick up that there's quite a lot of friction between South Cams and to a certain extent Huntingdonshire. And the reason for that is that those three councils are moving in slightly different strategic directions because they're not one unitary. If they became one unitary, then you would get this really, really good strategic alignment, i.e. that we would start from a really, really solid base, but then move forward on that side of things. I'm a bit cynical of the idea of having shared services as it currently is, because I think what shared services achieved to date has been at the very, very base level. It's let's procure equipment together, let's have common websites and things like that. Where they've really struggled is some of the more innovative stuff because of the different strategic directions. So I always think that potentially option E, I would think that South Cams and City, if they combine together in whatever form, I think they're probably much more likely to want to go their own way, and there would be quite a lot of friction across shared services, which I don't think would be ideal. That's really the point. I would like to see that piece strengthened, because I'd like to know what the numbers are specifically. I did some brief research on it, and it was somewhere between 10 and 25 million. The cost of, for example, if you had to create your own IT system. So if we did, for example, went to option A, that would be quite a significant cost to us, and I think that needs to be in the report. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. So just to pick up on a couple of points there. So you're right to talk about the strong base on shared services, particularly around ICT and other services as well. That is the case across the districts. I think one thing to bear in mind is that the new unitary that is formed will also have to integrate those county council services. So they will need to be broken down and put together around a new geography. So fundamentally, there are still, regardless of whichever option's picked, some really significant challenges around the delivery of that new ICT environment from day one. So a new network, new security, new systems, data migrated over, new cybersecurity, and the list goes on. So taking that from county and pulling that into whatever new unitary is formed alongside whatever blend of district services is a significant task. So I just want to give a voice of realism alongside that really strong base that we've got, just to recognise the scale of that challenge that we're bringing forward, and particularly with that county council data being highly sensitive, difficult stuff to deal with. So, and that's got to be right from day one. So that's a significant challenge. I think in terms of how we might work with other partners, absolutely, the shared service agenda that we've got, the ways of working is really strong. But another fundamental for me, I think, in terms of thinking about the new unitary that is formed, you will still be putting together different council district services together. So at the moment, we do share a shared network. We do share some shared systems, for example, how we might deliver waste. But each of those is implemented in line with the district or city council's priorities and services as it stands. The real sweet spot with a new unitary being formed is the opportunity to bring those aspects together to deliver services consistently and to use the same applications in one way rather than potentially three. So absolutely right to recognise some of the core strengths of shared services. Just those other factors need to be borne in mind, which leads to your final point, which is about the cost of change. And those costs are significant. Absolutely, they will run to many millions of pounds. But again, the context is a little like earlier, really. In terms of the overall operating budget of those new organisations that are created, it's a relatively small proportion, and it will be something that we've paid out over time as those new changes come through. So absolutely right to recognise significant challenges around it and significant cost. Just in context of big organisations with many hundreds of £1 million revenue budgets, the cost of that change is, I think, absorbable and is reflected within the costings we've put together as well.
Going to come next to Councillor Bywater and then Councillor Jennings.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I take in Councillor Hassell's point about option C. I just find it a little unusual that if it's such a strong option, then we have a list of the councils that have already decided what they want, and option C is not listed in any of those. So, I take your point. I just want to come back to education, and I know I've discussed this offline with Mike and Michelle in our meetings that we've had over the course of the last few weeks. But page 531 of this report, Newton's report, touches on various things like school population, homes to school transport, SEND. But I have some serious concerns about education and the future of our local schools when it comes to the delivery of whatever option. And this was discussed on option A at the county council, and I saw very little evidence of it. And it feels through as though the strategic delivery of and the importance and funding of education has sort of been overlooked in this process. And I'm saying this so members of the public can see this and understand it really. There's been very limited discussions with School Forum, and as you know, School Forum as a county level decide where the money goes for the school. They have certain blocks that they have to allocate to SEND for maintenance, new delivery of schools. That's decided, and they're not really engaged in this process. So whatever we look at, whatever option we go for, it seems to be missing, because ultimately it's going to be a huge budgetary pressure, whatever the option is at the end of the day. And the funding models and the shared services of schools are critically important, and these structural changes have the potential to significantly disrupt schools, budgets, special educational need provision, and the overall quality of education that all our children. And I know we've got to be looking at the whole county as a whole, but me as an elected member, I have to be concerned that if we draw a line in the sand where we look at option D potentially, we could have Huntingdonshire schools or old Huntingdonshire schools at a disadvantage compared to some schools that are currently in Huntingdonshire. What does that look like? Who understands what that looks like? Because I've seen no business case in relation to that. And I think we need to treat education, we talk about strategic plans and priorities, but education is huge to every resident within the district. And I think we're not seeing that we're certainly not seeing option D, and I've got concerns about that with an option D. But I think in option E, I think, we're good at what we do in Huntingdonshire, but I'd just like to see that strengthened, really. Thank you.
So I'm going to try and cover this in a fairly straightforward way. So the reference you've made, Councillor Bywater, is to the work that's been undertaken by Newton. They were commissioned by the two unitaries as the kind of lead bodies for all educational matters. They have been, it is a shared data set that's been looked at across the region and adopted in that way, given it's had the oversight by the relevant directors that are responsible for those adult and social care and educational services. So essentially it's a factual data set as far as we can sit here as officers and our consultants advising you. So in terms of the numbers, etc., that have been come out of this, that has played into the work that local partnerships and indeed Beth and others have been looking at, because cards on the table. We are not the experts in that space. Newton are, along with our unitary colleagues. The other comments that you made, I note the sentiment of them, etc. There wasn't really a question in there that I could answer, other than to just say the information you've got there is the baseline position from the experts in the field. I think what I would also just remind people is, in terms of the matter about engagement, whilst the government has talked about the criteria around engagement and has essentially said we would like to see engagement as part of the first stage of process, we've got to remember as well there is that formal statutory consultation that the government has to do. And at that stage, there is an opportunity for anybody, any of the bodies you've referenced, anybody sat around this table, anybody sat watching at home, that's the opportunity for them to feed in before the final decision is made by the Secretary of State. So coming back to that point about engagement, as I just say, those parties may not have been involved to this date on respective business cases, but there is an opportunity at the relevant point in future. Everything else, I'm afraid I can't comment on. It's a matter for the politicians.
Can I come in then just briefly and say, one of the real challenges we have, and Simon, to Councillor Bywater, you and I have worked in this sector, and I know that we've sat in the same sort of meetings over a number of years. One of the real challenges we have is we also have moving elements within the education sector. So we know the government is due to produce a white paper. It was due to publish that some months ago. It's been delayed again. We don't know quite what it's going to say, although everybody's having a very good guess. Whatever we do with local government reorganisation, we are then going to have to layer a government white paper on top of that. One of the things that I think is encouraging is, because our health services already deliver around localities, and lots of our schools are organised around localities. Some of our academies trusts are organised around localities, around, the feeder schools with the secondary school. It doesn't all work like that, but there is quite a lot of that. I suspect that actually we can work around the challenges around lines on maps where they arise, but it will be absolutely critical to make sure that every single child that's either in school or will be coming into school or is going on to further education, or in other words, wherever they are in the system now or will be, it's going to be essential that we make sure that is a really smooth process. We know that some children do access services which are across borders. It's a line on a map. Actually, it makes no difference. It's 3 minutes down the road. So we already know it happens. But that's going to be a real challenge for the new unitaries, is to make sure that that education piece is the best it can be. It probably will work, because I suspect, given where we might be going, that sort of the current district blocks probably naturally fit that. I suspect it gets more complicated where we start splitting district blocks.
Cool, thank you. I'm going to come next to Councillor Jennings and then Councillor Alban.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to turn to a subject that's very close to my heart, which is cost savings. I've got really a two-pronged question. First is about the overall level of cost savings and the payback time, and the second is about some specific assumptions that you've used in getting to what those cost savings are. And looking specifically at option C, I think, page 133 has savings of between 6.2 and 6.4 million a year on an ongoing basis under option C. And I think when I looked at a table further down, page 319, it was split roughly 3 million between each of the two authorities. I think there may be an error on one of the graphs on page 149, where it seems to suggest that Unitary 2 is getting almost 20 million of savings a year on an ongoing basis. I don't know whether the graph is just sort of out, so it might be worth looking at that. And the payback for the option C is just over 3 years, and the payback on option D, the overall payback, notwithstanding Councillor Hassell's points that actually one of those unitaries is not achieving part of that savings, but the overall payback is over 8 years. I read in your report, the final appendix, that actually there was something, and it was on page 613, it referred to a 5-year assessment window. And really, I want to understand, is that 5-year assessment window something that government has mandated, or is this something that we are looking at as just a generic way of trying to see what that payback period is like? I don't know whether you want to answer that question and then the specifics, or give you the specifics at the same.
Yes, no, I can take that. You know, that 5 years is a judgment we made rather than anything that was prescribed. We thought that was a reasonable medium term, given, you know, if you look longer, there's a lot of the uncertainty grows about all sorts of things. So we thought 5 years was reasonable.
Okay, great. So notwithstanding then that the 8-year payback on option E wouldn't automatically be thrown out because it didn't fit some sort of criteria. I think that's what I was just trying to understand. And on the specifics, and there was very helpful appendices about, one of the appendix talked about how some of those savings of cost assumptions were made up. And there are 3 I'd like to pick up on. One is talking about duplicated heads at levels 1 and 2. In the management structure, and it talked about that if there is duplication, then 1 is removed. What I'm trying to understand is, in a option C, for example, where you end up with 2 unitary authorities, your duplication is actually that you might have 3 or 4 of those heads at levels 1 and 2. And does that mean that 1 is removed for each duplication, or does it mean that 1 is removed out of the 3 or 4 that there might be, or does it mean that just 1 is removed and you're left with 2 or 3? So that's the first question on those head assumptions. On the member allowances, I think there might be a little bit of over-egging, because I really feel that, and without being parochial about this, you know, that, and equally I'm on record for not just this authority, but on authorities I've sat on beforehand, that, you know, I don't think I've ever voted for an increase in member allowances, and I probably never will. But I think it's unrealistic to think that the allowances for the new unitary authorities are going to be as a average of what the allowances currently are on the existing authorities, because I think that, frankly, when you look at other unitary authorities, they'll be considerably more, the basic allowance considerably more than what the county is currently offering. And the third point relates slightly actually to what Councillor Gardner and Councillor Hassel talked about, the shared services before, which is this 5% overall savings by coming together and getting those general savings. Has any allowance been made here for the fact that you know, acting together in this shared service has already achieved a lot of these savings under 3CT? And when looking at that, is that 5% in addition to that? And in that case, would the savings for those options that don't involve going along the lines of the existing 3CT, of the 3 county shared services, would their savings be greater?
That's fine. Let me starting with the first one then, on how we've approached the senior level savings, and conscious of being of who we've got in the room. I'll talk about, say, finance directors, section 151 officers. That's my background. I'm an accountant, but you can understand the point that if you've got, say, 5 councils becoming 1 council, then you only need 1 section 151 officer. So that's all we've done there. So we would then remove 4 section 151 officers from that cost envelope. You know, and nothing's personalised, of course. It's just a spread on a spreadsheet exercise. So that's how we've done that at levels 1 and 2. Member allowances, of course, you know, it's a judgment call on the levels. And all of this is based on assumptions that, at best, and what we try and do as best we can is to evidence and justify the basis of the assumption and the reference. So yes, that's what we've done. We've taken an average of current unitary allowances, whether current other unitaries, yeah. But clearly, you know, that's not necessary to say that will be exactly the figures that will eventually be in play. And then in terms of the 5% overall savings, we haven't looked at, we've been very explicit about this, we haven't looked at the potential that could come from the wider service reorganisation, the opportunities that shared services brings, that what effectively is labelled transformation. We've been very clear that we'll focus on what is the tangible savings that we can see that are eminently achievable. And so that saving has been around looking at third-party spend. So we've looked at the third-party expenditure of all the councils and looked where there's common suppliers. And it's that's been the 5% that's been applied to that figure. So what we'd say in general is that we have been very prudent in the level of savings. If you compare what is set out in our analysis and compare it to other business cases, you'll see that there are bigger figures. But they're based on a whole host of assumptions around transformation. We've talked about some of the issues in relation to ICT. And there has to be a consideration of what savings have already come out of the sector through initiatives that you reference.
Hopefully, again, to just provide confidence in the approach, as Martin said here, it is a very prudent approach. It's informed by, obviously, their particular background and experience as local partnerships serving the wider local government industry. There is lots of information out there about the lessons learned from other examples, and the feedback about those is it's always an interesting balance looking back in hindsight of why did people reach those conclusions and are those transformation figures reasonable? And the only way you know that is with 100% hindsight in several years' time. But what we've tried to do here is one of the common themes that's come out is safe and legal day one. That will be the focus from whenever, the structural changes orders put in place. The focus will be on safe and legal day one. It's then about how you balance those transitional savings in the next period of time versus then getting into the detail of, as John said earlier, the kind of detail of individual business processes and when you unlock savings, when you unlock asset transfers, all of those sorts of things. But I think the candid feedback from across the sector, the readout that we've got is safe and legal day one is the focus. We've had that from North Hants, West North Hants as local examples to us. So what I want to be really clear on here from an officer perspective to members is we would hope that what you have is a prudent, well-balanced, carefully considered and the best professional advice representing us in that way. Others may take a more skewed view one way or other. We're not here to do that. We're here to advise you and make sure that these guys are giving you the best information to make your decisions.
Mike's absolutely right on that. And one final point from me, I guess, as well, is that the forward plan for spend, services, choices will sit with the new unitary authority as well. So it will make decisions itself around the nature of services it wants to offer, that blend of statutory, non-statutory stuff. So building that into the model makes it even more complex because we cannot sit here and make those assumptions around what the operating budget will be of those new organisations. New members will come in, new strategies will be set and officers will deliver against it. Hence that real reason for being prudent. A new authority will have new priorities.
Perfect. Going to come next to Councillor Alban and then after that, Councillor Gladdo.
Thanks again, Chair. On one of the pages, I think it's page 187, one of the reports, it talks about local councillors who understand their area. And one of the things I'm currently on is a member development working group, and we've got the Who Become a Councillor session coming up. And I think as well as those of us who currently sit on local authorities are going to have some serious thought sessions about what we want to do in the future, whether we offer ourselves up for election. Other local residents who want to come into local politics for the first time may have to have a serious think. With any unitary authority, I've looked to a certain extent at the proposals for Peterborough that mainly focused on options E and option C, and there seems to be quite a bit of disparity on proposed ward member sizes. There's nearly 1,000 elector difference between the largest and the smallest in Huntingdonshire. In East Cambridgeshire, in South Cambridgeshire, it's even more pronounced. We've currently got 52 Huntingdonshire district councillors and 17 county councillors serving the existing Huntingdonshire, which brings a total of 69. And the reports on both options E and option C propose to make that 35 fewer at 34, which I think is an incredible workload to put on prospective councillors and councillors who are elected. To ask councillors, even on multi-member wards and even allowing for the current double hatting that goes on at the moment, to make those kind of adjustments. I think that's a huge ask. And my concern is that we'll end up with a council that's disproportionately represented by the wealthy, the retired, the wealthy retired, the spouses of the aforementioned, and full-time political hacks. And there won't be room for the young parent, the single parent, the people that work full-time, the people that work out of the area. So my question on this is, can we reassess the wards and the number of councillors ahead of the 2027 elections, or do we have to do what I think Northamptonshire have done, was run their first elections on existing boundaries and then go for review for their ahead of their next elections?
Yeah, I can pick that one up. So our understanding is that the Local Government Boundary Commission can't do a boundary review of any organisation until it's a legal entity. So what we've put forward in the proposal is in line with the government guidance to use the existing either county divisions or the wards that we currently have in the district area. So looking at the kind of, just to explain sort of methodology of how we've got to the number that we have, essentially we've looked at kind of the electorate to member ratio across the divisions, the county divisions, and then the district wards. And looking at both of those, the county division has a more equal ratio across the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough region. So it's a bit equal in terms of parity of representation, which is why we've gone with that view. And the kind of reduction in councillor numbers, we understand that the expectation from government is that through the local government reorganisation process, those numbers of councillors will decrease, and we're expected to decrease them through what we're putting forward in the proposals. So that's just kind of a bit of an explanation as to why it is decreased in that sense. Obviously, kind of the considerations that you put forward in terms of workload is really important and something that later boundary review will pick up. But there is also scope for when we get the structural change order in place, when the decision is made by government, to feed into the contents of that structural change order, which will include warding, electoral arrangements, etc. So there is further scope to kind of develop this a little bit further when we feed that back to government. But we've kind of set this forward using the existing divisions that we have, because that is kind of the best solution ahead of that later boundary review once we're a legal new authority.
And I think if I may supplement Beth's brilliant answer on that particular point, I think again, referring to that interim feedback that I mentioned earlier, the government has been challenged on that, of kind of how do you balance up bigger authorities with less members and the financial savings that might come with that on the one front, with place identity, retaining local engagement, all of those things that are really important to members. And that's where it talks about, recognising strong community voice, and this talk of local government reorganisation continuing to facilitate better and sustained community engagement, needing a clear and accountable system of local area working and governance. And there's talk about neighbourhood area committees, all of those sorts of things, increased roles of town and parish councils. Again, a lot of that, as John referred to earlier, are going to be decisions for the new authority once it's up and running in terms of how its governance arrangements are established. There is that kind of intermediary step that Beth has talked about, which is once the structural order's there and we know what new authorities are going to be created, what can we influence in that space on day one? And then where we are now, which is we're being asked by government to put forward members being asked to put forward an option, and we're trying to give you the best tool that we can, which is a modelled set of assumptions that kind of tries to narrow those variables down. So hopefully that kind of gives you the understanding of why we've arrived at, but completely it's not lost on any of us that have been involved in this, some of the points that you've raised, and it has come out strongly in a number of other areas. So hopefully that helps, Councillor Olwen.
Just briefly, I'm assuming this is a government thing. It concerns me as well about talking about the number of electors, because it's not just electors that have have ward problems. You know, some 17 and 16-year-old particularly might have an educational problem. A number of us will have foreign nationals living in our ward, particularly those that have. I mean, Americans are the first thing that springs to mind with the Old Cumbria Air Base. You know, constituency individual problems aren't limited to electors, but that may be out of our hands. So just to clarify on Beth's point, is it possible, even if the wards don't change, the number of councillors might change? My concern is if you've got an area like Huntingdon, it's more, I know there's different areas of Huntingdon, but it's a more obvious community with a lot of people in. Whereas if you go out into the Fens, or I'm trying not to be too parochial, but if you go out into rural Huntingdonshire, I'll take Councillor Capner's area, for example, it's a lot bigger area for a councillor to get round, and whatever political hue they are, you know, even if there's an adjustment, that still is a big ask. So if we can able to tweak the number, if we can't tweak the wards, that would reassure me.
I think it's definitely something that we could look at in terms of figuring out how to kind of calculate that and what would be the best fit for each ward in terms of the proposal that we're putting forward. And I think that work can then continue into that feedback towards the structural change order. I think ultimately we can figure out how we want to feed that information back, but the structural change order in itself will outline that number of councillors and those warding arrangements directly. So I think just to clarify that the government will be the decision maker on that first initial point of warding arrangements in the new unitary, but we can definitely have a look at that in order to feed that back to them.
And I'm just going to add one point before I bring Lisa in to add a bit more, because she's kind of led on that work stream. Again, this comes back to how we've tried to coordinate across the region of different, trying to kind of, the democratic services managers have all kind of tried to have a look at this and kind of feed in their thoughts and views. And it is that piece about time that we haven't talked about tonight. We are on a definitive deadline that a proposal has to go in by that 28th of November. We're not that far away from that now. So in terms of the ability to make significant, sizable shifts to the business case, frankly, that's going to be putting us up against it to do that. And it's actually how fundamental is that to the overall success of the business case in terms of the minimum criteria. The point about tweaks, etc., there is a time and a place that we can feed back further comments, further evidence at that point in time through the statutory consultation phase. So I just want to manage expectations that if members either tonight or full council or cabinet said, yeah, we really want to go with this option, but can we put the number up on this? It's not just a simple change of the spreadsheet, it's actually what the implications of that through the whole business case are, because changing the number of members has a financial implication that we have to consider. And the fact is, if we want to be in the game, at the end of it, we have to have something in by the 28th on behalf of the council. And I'll just bring Lisa in just to talk about the work stream work.
I'll get there in the end. Through you, Chair, apologies. Just to pick up on your point about tweaking it in terms of the representation across the area. There is the requirement in the guidance says we've got to have equality of representation across all the areas, and noting your point that there are going to be variables across the whole county, absolutely. But the guidance says ultimately there's an expectation that we will reduce in numbers. The guidance is the new unitary will be between 30 and 100 councillors. So absolutely there is going to be a massive reduction, and completely take on board in all of our discussions, when we've been having discussions with our counterparts, it is a concern. It's a concern expressed by all of our partners as well, really. But I think certainly it will be reviewed, and the expectation that the LGBCE, Local Government Boundary Commission for England, will be undertaking a review within the lifetime of the first term of office. So, and picking up on Mike's point, ordinarily in an ideal world, we'd have an inordinate amount of time to do an electoral review. Those who've been through it before, it takes a long time to do a full-scale review, but we are where we are, and we're working to a very tight timeline. So it's not an ideal solution, and certainly not by any stretch, absolutely. And I think it will have put a pressure on members, absolutely. So there isn't an ideal answer and there isn't an ideal solution, but I just think we are restricted by the guidance that we're working within with the LGBTE as well.
Perfect. And can I just thank you as well, Councillor Orban, for raising that point, as that's a concern I've had, especially with the representation of younger councillors going forward. And personally, I think that's one of the massive flaws with the process that the government's laid out here. Before I come next to Councillor Gledo, I'm conscious we've just hit the 2-hour mark. I've got 3 more speakers left. If there is any more people who want to come in after that, I'm happy to offer a comfort break now at the 2-hour mark. But if there is not any more speakers than that, I don't think it's worth taking it. So I'm going to take that as we're going to press on with the 3 last speakers and anyone else there. So, Councillor Gledo.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to, first of all, thank the officers for all the work that's been done and the business cases. Having done this myself in the past, I fully understand where you're all coming from and understand how much work and effort's actually been involved in this. One of the things I did want to bring up, and we actually haven't touched on it, is risk. And actually the whole issue of benefits realisation, because I see them very much hand in hand. We've used euphemisms like challenges and pressure and all the rest of it, rather than actually cutting to it and just saying, what are the big fundamental risks that we actually have. And I would very much like your views on what the biggest risks associated. Understanding there's various categories before we go into that, get that, but obviously some of the big risks as you see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe I'll talk quickly around some of the financial ones. Simon will talk around the economic and growth projections, and Mike, Beth and John will talk about organisationally. But financially, back to my point about our prudence, we've just focused on, from a savings perspective, the risk about delivering the benefits, about ones that pretty much drop out as a consequence of reorganisation. So my example around senior officers, the number of members changes is pretty much automatically default by the virtue that you become in different organisations. ICT, the implementation side of it, the transition cost is a big risk area. And that you, like everyone else across the sector that's going through LGR, are at a very early stage of assessing what that looks like, what resources are available, the programme management, the implementation. ICT is moving very quickly in terms of technology, digital AI, what the solutions potentially are. But that is where the big risk lies from a financial perspective. Simon, do you want to say about the economic growth?
Yeah. I think probably they are linked risks, and so in terms of the some of the financial pressures and the financial risks, I think probably one of the significant ones that really affects the scoring here is the risks related to service delivery, and in particular when we're talking about economic development, the delivery of development, infrastructure, and growth. And I think one of the key things there is almost what is the significance of change between what we've got now and whatever the option is, and the impact that has on the ability to continue delivering development sites, growth, the infrastructure. So I think that's probably the main area that I think of, and that's reflected in the scoring. That where you've got something which continue, whether it's an administrative boundary, whether it's a team that continue working, then that risk obviously can be reduced. Where you are creating something completely new, then obviously that risk is greater.
Thank you. And just to give a bit of kind of operational context, those are forward-looking risks, how we deliver changes and so on. We've already done work within this organisation looking at the implications of LGR and our risk profile. So there's a whole set of corporate risks that have been raised. In terms of accountability, each of those, I think there's about a dozen, have been allocated to one of CLT leads, that's Director or Chief Executive Lead, and we've now apportioned those out to relevant heads of service and other officers to work through. So, for example, one of those key risks is around exactly what's just been highlighted, delivering continuous business as usual service, corporate plan, all the objectives that we're working towards at the same time as delivering a once in a 50-year change to our organisation is a significant risk. So that's mitigated by having those forward plans, about having appropriate resources against it, having conversations with officers, members to make sure that we are committed to the right things in the right way. So we've genuinely sat down and done that activity already in place. And I think a key thing for me as well, which has been touched on by colleagues from local partnerships as well, the delivery of change and moving towards that will be resourced across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Effective programme management, project plans, and within that, absolutely real quality control around risks, issues. So we deal with things that might happen and we deal with things that are happening. So we'll absolutely have that robust programme management. It has to get us over the line.
Can I add just a political spin to that? In the sense that everything we do has risk, as in everything. And none of this is without risk. The thing without risk would probably be to say, we're just not doing LGR, and that's not on the table. We have to do it. I'm going to quote one of our officers, risk versus reward. Sorry, Michelle. But you say it, and actually it has stuck with me, that all of the decisions we have to make, there is going to be an element of risk. You know, none of these are risk-free. But I think one of the real challenges for us is balancing risk with, and what would be the upside that actually would give us something really, really positive back. I'm going to leave it there, but I think that's a challenge for all of us. I don't have the answer for it, but I'm just going to put that there. You've got risk, you've got good mitigations, but there are opportunities that could come from these decisions too. So don't think of it all as being terrifying. It's an opportunity too.
If I can just come back and obviously say I totally understand that, but my own experience is that benefits realisation is never cost neutral. So you always have to invest, and that's actually the whole point. And it comes back to the whole issue of risk and reward, because you have to put the work and effort and spend the money in order to actually deliver the benefits. And they're, as I said, they're usually very expensive. Thank you.
And I think, just to reiterate earlier, again, Beth has lived and breathed this and kind of liaised with a number of chief execs that have taken organisations through this. And unfortunately, you know, we don't have the benefit of 100% hindsight. You know, all that we can say is that we're trying to pick up the lessons learned from those exercises. We've deliberately, again, we've talked about being prudent and not tried to overinflate something, because actually we as officers, the reason the report you've got in front of you is in the way it is it's not trying to say definitively you must choose a particular option or everything points towards that, because actually that is the learned experience of other places where they've overplayed those potentially, however you want to read that. But at the same time, there is that balance of making a compelling case to government for a particular option, and it is a very fine twist of the dial of how to do that. But I think what we've been really clear on, Beth's been engaged in the risk work stream. We've had RSM, our retained advisors on that. That's been feeding into a prudent approach that local partnerships have adopted. So I would say that from an organisational perspective, we've had kind of the widest oversight of risk to hopefully give you that confidence when you make your decision.
Cool. Thank you. I'm going to come in next, and I've got Councillor Catmer down as the last speaker after that. So if anyone else has anything to raise, please make yourself known fairly soon. I want to talk a bit about criteria 5, as I don't think we've spoken much about it compared to the others, but the criteria that new unitary structures must support devolution arrangements. So I think we're in a very unique situation in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, that we are one of the areas going through LGR that already has a combined authority. And obviously, government is pushing through its devolution agenda, either through new combined authorities or, in the case of ours, new powers to the existing one there. Looking through the business cases, the current proposal appears to be to keep the current CPCA board, but to give 2 representatives to each new unitary authority across all of the business cases there. However, all of the proposed unitaries have a different size to them, and therefore, it's one of the words of the evening, a different kind of geographical balance that will provide on the CPCA board. And I'm looking to make this point not politically, but purely on a geographical basis here. given that's the proposals that we're looking to put to government in these business cases, or whichever business case would be going forward, if that was to include a unitary which had quite a significant population imbalance, not asking people to second guess the Secretary of State here, but is that something that could be viewed quite negatively by the government there and could potentially hamper a business case if it provided a geographical imbalance on our existing devolution frameworks?
Again, I think it is a very good question, Councillor Hunt, and probably one that we hadn't anticipated, to be fair. And I don't think we know is the honest answer to that. I think, again, it comes back to Councillor Jennings' point. The headline piece is about supporting devolution. But when we talk about that devolution agenda, when you look at the guidance, it is not just simply, do you have a combined authority and how many board members or seats do you have on that? It does factor in things like the functional economic geography, the FEMA, which, as we know in this area, going back to 2018 with the SPEAR report as the baseline, 3 functional economic areas. The CPCA's local growth plan that has just come out talks about the prominence of Cambridge feeding the entire region, the rapid growth of Peterborough feeding the entire region, and essentially the middle bit that's all interconnected. So again, that's where, in terms of the difference of the scoring, that's where that arrives from. But in terms of your point about would it be seen negatively by Secretary of State, I wouldn't want to second guess on that particular point.
No, thank you very much on that. Coming lastly to Councillor Catmer, unless anyone else has any final points.
Thank you very much, Chair. I didn't mean to be the last person. It's just happened. I've listened in. I think we've kicked this fairly well, if you did use the expression of kicking the tyres. As overview and scrutiny, I think we've been through this. We've all brought our angles to it. It's been really useful. And it's not a tie-in with Councillor Gledo at all, but I'm going to talk risk because I read chapter 13.2 because that always interests me. Anyone who writes risks knows I'm going to read their chapter. Listening to your responses, there might be a few things missing in that you could strengthen it with. Most of them are in there, but you had to I was unpicking the words as you said them. But I think the key risk in there, and it does say the principal risk, is that we don't make a decision. At Council and at Cabinet, we need to make a decision. We need to get into the game. We cannot risk not being in it. And I think it says the principal risk, and I totally agree. And that's what I'm hearing. Everyone's agreeing with that, basically. We might disagree which way we'd like to go, but we're not disagreeing about we must be in and we must submit. Sorry, I didn't mean to end it.
I'll probably hand over to Councillor Conboy to finish up, but I think it is, you will see it's not referenced within the risk section in too great detail, but we have considered within the report the do nothing option. And essentially the do nothing option isn't a viable option. My reading of this from the Office of Space is the government have been very clear with their direction of travel that this is going to happen. Other authorities have kind of sort of tried to say, well, can we hide away from this and bury our head in the sand? And that, the feedback has been, no, you don't want to necessarily do that. I think from our Office of Space, we've looked at that and said, no, doing nothing is not a viable option for this authority in terms of that. But I'll probably hand over to Councillor Conboy on the political side.
And then, but I think that's a wonderful point on which probably to end this part of the meeting before we hand back to the chair. I think that's the bit that all of us need to take back into then the council debate. We want a proper open debate. We want council to genuinely consider the options it has before it. And then, there will be an opportunity for council to then comment on those options, and people will have an opportunity to have their choice recorded, or no choice. But I think the risk of council not submitting is one we probably don't want to go down. So the answer is we are going to have to make a recommendation, as in at council. You're all going to have your views. You're all going to have a chance to have a vote. We promised you we'd do that. I think it's really, really important. It's then got to go to cabinet. Hopefully council gives a really, really clear steer about where its thinking is. But it's 52 people and you're all going to have your own opinions. So I think on that point, I'm going to hand back to the chair, but can I just say, Chair, that we've had some brilliant conversations this evening, some really pertinent questions, really, really incredibly thought-provoking, and to thank everybody, because I think by the time I hope we get into full debate, actually we will have explored lots of the things that people who've then been able to either watch live tonight or will watch back. Hopefully we've answered lots of those questions that people were thinking, and I'm not sure. So I'd just like to thank everybody for fantastic questions this evening and really pertinent comments. I think it's been incredibly helpful.
And thank you very much for that, Councillor Conboy. So following on from this evening, I can confirm that all of the comments made will be published as a supplement to the Council and Cabinet agendas for those bodies to consider and bring the item to a conclusion over the coming days. Can I thank all the members who have come this evening and kind of engaged so well? Can I also thank all of the officers who have supported this evening, not just the ones you've seen presenting, but those over in the AV team, the security. Can I also pay a special thank you to Beth, who I know has done an incredible amount of work on this item, and I believe it will be echoed by not just all of us members, but I believe the officers as well. And finally, just say thank you all for your time this evening, and I look forward to the full council meeting next week. Thank you.